All right, well, let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen. Today at Mass, our responsorial psalm really struck me, and so I want to just return to that briefly for our opening prayer, parts of Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the desolate pit, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust, who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after false gods. Sacrifice and offering you do not desire. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. I delight to your will, O God, your law is within my heart. I have told the glad news of deliverance in the great congregation. Behold, I have not restrained my lips, as you know, O Lord. I have not hidden your saving help within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and of your salvation. I have not concealed your mercy and your faithfulness from the great congregation. As for me, I am poor and needy, but the Lord takes thought for me. You are my help and my deliverer. Do not delay, O my God. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So my talk was going to be a little different before Mass this morning, and as I heard that responsorial psalm, I thought, my gosh, this is just absolutely perfect for kind of the talk that I had prepared. And so Father James Morin was the celebrant this morning, and I told him after Mass that he actually gave the homily on Psalm 40, which you hardly ever hear and see in the Catholic Church. So I was very appreciative of that, because that helped. It might make my talk just a little bit better. So what I did is I kind of designed a little bit about my walk of faith according to Psalm 40. And so when it says that he drew me out of a miry bog, the Lord has done that really for me a couple of times in my life. So the first time was at the time of my baptism. So we're all drawn out of that miry bog in our baptism and given the opportunity for eternal life. None of us really remember that if we're baptized as an infant, but we can look back at that and say, hey, that was a really good thing. So as a child, I was really blessed with a very blessed upbringing. And I think what that instilled in me is a lot of loyalty toward my faith and loyalty toward the church. I was continually blessed then as I aged, because nothing ever really drew a wedge between me and my faith. And so many times in our world today, we see young children who get that wedge driven in between their faith and their relationship with God, because of things like hypocrisy or bad example by other Catholics or Christians, or just really traumatic events in their life. I never experienced that as a child, and so I look back on that and just realize how blessed I was, and how that can really ruin a relationship with God, and not at the fault of the child many times. And 99% of the time, it's not the child's fault. The child didn't contribute to it at all, but it can really be a problem. So, in my walk of faith and in my coming to the point where I'm at in my faith today, I'm just very grateful for the fact that I was in a family and in a community and in a parish that allowed me to be a loyal Catholic without ever making me doubt the faith or doubt God's love for me or anything like that. So I was drawn out of the miry bog, and with loyalty and that blessing, I was able to continue my walk of faith all the way up into my college years and beyond. But then I started to turn astray, and I started to follow some false gods, as most of us do in our younger maturity age. The things of the world call us. So maybe we're in high school or college or early in our professional career, and things like money and notoriety and those types of things kind of draw us away. And so as I look back at that now, at the time I never would have said, yeah, I'm following a false god. But now as I look back at that, I can see where different interests in my life and different pursuits I was taking were really I was being drawn back into that miry bog. And so I questioned whether my feet were on solid rock, at some point. But it took a lot of years of kind of being back into that miry bog before I started asking myself questions about, is the Catholic faith true? Do I really believe in all the Catholic Church teaches? Are there other things out there in the world that are more true or equally true, or things like that? And so as I got older and older, got married, Carmen and I started having children, I would get asked questions because I was known to be Catholic. I wasn't a very active and outgoing Catholic. I would primarily go to Mass on Sundays and go to confession a few times a year. But I wasn't anything else. So a lot of times people would come up to me and ask me questions about the Catholic faith because they just knew I was Catholic and maybe they didn't know any other Catholics. So after Carmen and I got married and started having children, I knew that one of the obligations of any Christian parent is to hand the faith down to their children. I don't know why I knew this. I just knew it. It was probably something I'd learned earlier in my high school days, maybe, or grade school days in Catholic school. But at some point along there, I decided if I'm going to hand the Catholic faith down to my children, I need to be very confident that it is true, and it is good and it is beautiful. So I started looking around for resources to double check. So I looked at some non-Catholic resources, I looked at some non-Christian resources, and what I found out there was an abundance of really, really good Catholic content. So for any non-Catholic resource I found that would question the teaching of the Church, I was able to find numerous resources that supported the Catholic Church teaching. And then I would compare that to secular sources and look at science and history and logic and things like that to make sure that what this Catholic resource or these Catholic resources were saying was reliable and true, and it wasn't kind of fake news like we hear about today in some of the media, because you can get drawn into kind of reaffirming or supporting what you want the answer to be. You can find the sources to support whatever you want to believe. And I didn't want that. When I was talking about handing my faith down to the kids, I wanted to make sure that I was not misleading them, and not. I wanted to make sure that their feet were also placed on firm rock. So I started to check the sources, making sure what I passed down was accurate and true. So some of the resources that I found at that time, Spirit Catholic Radio was pretty young at that point. One of the things that I really enjoyed reading was, I think it's Ask the Register in the Southern Nebraska Register. Every week there was really good information in that. And so I'd actually been reading that for years because I found that to be interesting. Then I also discovered through Catholic Radio, Catholic Answers, and their website, and a whole bunch of other things. But in the process, I also found a lot of anti-Catholic and non-Catholic content as well that I'll talk about in a minute. So the Psalm, talks about setting your feet upon rock, and so that's kind of how I did it. I looked at these other resources to make sure that what I thought was true actually was true, and what I believed was worthy of believing. So the Psalm goes on, and it talks about restraining a person's lips to tell the glad news of deliverance. And so once I started gaining more and more confidence in my faith, and I was learning more about it and more equipped to explain our faith to people that had doubts or questions or concerns about the faith, I started to go to some of these non-Catholic websites, and sometimes a non-Catholic publication that was also online and had commentary opportunities to it, and I would explain the faith. And what I found was that I wasn't restraining my lips. I was telling the truth, but the way that I was telling it really wasn't doing anybody any good. So it was causing a little bit of vitriol in some of my conversations, and it just didn't go very well. I left those experiences in the first few years of kind of cutting my teeth on apologetics and evangelization with not a very good feeling in my heart. It was something that I would get done, and I would know that I won the argument, or I would know that I made some very good points, or I would know that, you know, the other person came up with some arguments that I've heard before that I knew were not good arguments. But I didn't have a settled feeling in my heart. I didn't feel good about it. And I knew the other person probably left that conversation no closer to being Catholic or Christian or having a deep relationship with Christ than they had started. In many cases, probably they were further away from that because of the conversation we had and the way that it had gone. So I had done that for, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5, 6 months, and at one point I decided I can't do that anymore. This is not benefiting anybody. I'm practicing on these poor people, but I'm not going to practice on them anymore like this, because I want these conversations to be at least beneficial for the other party, if not mutually beneficial. So it was not beneficial for either one of us. So I decided that, as the Psalm says, delighting in my own will and not waiting patiently for the Lord, I was causing trouble, because I was really kind of getting into these conversations for a self-serving manner, to, again, gain knowledge for myself, to gain confidence in my own faith, but not really to share that faith in a good way with others that would bring them closer to Christ. So I decided to step away from apologetics and evangelization for a little while, and what I realized in that period of time was that for that, you know, probably 2 or 3 year period, I was gaining a lot of knowledge. I was again gaining a lot of confidence in the faith, but I wasn't engaging in much spiritual warfare. I wasn't engaging in much prayer. I was receiving, you know, the sacraments again, kind of like I always had, every Sunday, occasional confession, not a lot of daily prayer involved in it. If I read scripture, I would read it from an apologetic slant, you know, to prove somebody wrong. If they brought up this argument, I knew 10 verses that showed their argument was ridiculous. But it wasn't in a loving, caring, you know, evangelistic way. So I took about, I don't know, 6 months to a year, and I read some of the spiritual doctors of the church. I started praying a lot more with you know, the Rosary and Lectio Divina, and started going to daily Mass on occasion at that point, and started going to confession more regularly. So after about 6 months to a year of that, I thought, you know, I'm going to go back to some of these very same websites, and these are probably, at that point anyway, were the most anti-Catholic websites I could find on the internet. So you can imagine, you know, these people are not very receptive to even the best arguments and the most loving approach to that. But in any event, I thought I'm going to go back to those, and I'm going to see if anything has changed in the way that I'm sharing the faith with other people or defending the Catholic Church against these arguments that they're coming up with. And what I found immediately was that the conversations were much different. There was not, if there was antagonism and vitriol, it often was diffused very quickly. And once the conversation was over, which they ended a lot sooner than they would otherwise, because you get into conversation with some of these people, and they can just leave immediately, especially if you ask them a question. And I do a lot of that. But even if you make a good argument, they will just come back with any argument they can think of, and it usually ends up with a personal attack and myth and fiction. But in any event, what I found was the conversations were shorter, they were meatier, they produced good conversation in a lot of cases, and like I said, if there was defensiveness and anger and vitriol involved in the conversation, it was diffused much quicker, and in the previous go-around, those were never diffused at all. So it was very good to see a totally different. The other thing that I learned after this kind of return to Scripture and prayer and the sacraments more deeply was that I left these conversations myself with a lot more peace in my own heart. So there was times it never happened the previous 2 or 3 years that we'd get done with a fairly engaged intellectual conversation about something on the faith, and the other person would say, you know, you made some good points there. Or, you know, you mentioned this person, I'm going to go ahead and read that book, or anything like that. But that started happening more and more often. And I don't even know who these people are at that point. That was prior to Facebook. That was prior to actually knowing who the other person was. Nowadays, you get into some of these conversations and you know who they are, you know where they live, you know what they do for a living. You can look at their history a little bit. But these were all screen names of fictitious people that could have been anywhere in the world. So I don't know I never knew who they were. But they would open up a little bit to you, you know. So a few years later, locally, we had our change in our bishop here in Lincoln. So Bishop Bruskowitz had hit the age of 75 and submitted his resignation, and then we learned that Bishop Connolly was coming to the diocese. And that kind of riled up some of the more anti-Catholic people in the diocese because of the articles that were in the Lincoln Journal. So I started looking at some of the commentaries on the Lincoln Journal webpage, and I decided, boy, these people are really, I mean, they're just outlandish with their claims. And so I would offer, you know, the facts or maybe a little bit of information to them, and just immediately, once again, they would just blow up with anger. And there was just really not talking any sense to a lot of them. So at that point, I had never had a face-to-face conversation with a dyed-in-the-wool, full-out anti-Catholic. It had always been on, you know, these comment boxes on the internet. So I got the idea that, you know, maybe what I need to do is maybe offer to meet these people, because it's Lincoln, Nebraska, right? So I don't live too far from Lincoln. I can come there. And so I arranged something called, I think it was called Catholicism 101. And I called one of the coffee shops downtown, and I think it was the Mill, and I said, hey, you know, I'm thinking about having a Catholic kind of gathering, and would it be okay if I put a couple tables together in the back of your coffee shop and invite some people over and see what happens? And the guy said, oh yeah, that'd be fine, you know. So I arranged for that, and I tried to publicize a little bit by, I think there was a calendar that you get on the Lincoln Journal-Star, and I can't remember how I did it, but I wasn't very good at it, because the first time that we ever did it, it was me and 3 Catholics who just wanted to make sure that I wasn't the goofy one, really. So they were very knowledgeable, very faithful Catholics. So it's kind of nice to see them show up and be like, I'm going to defend the church if this guy's in that. So I thought, there's got to be something else I can do if I want to do this again. Well, the religious reporter for the Lincoln Journal-Star then heard about it, and she called me and said, hey, you know, we'd like to do a little story on you. And I said, well, that's great. So they did a nice big article on me, and so the next Catholicism 101, there was like 30 people at it, and there was some very vehement anti-Catholics, there were some non-Catholics, and then there was probably about 60% of it were pretty solid Catholics that knew their faith, including 2 of my cousins. So that was kind of funny. So we ended up having some nice conversations. But the thing that I noticed in that is that the people that I was clearly having the conversations with online were not willing to have a conversation with me face to face. So even the most anti-Catholic people that came to the coffee shop over the course of that, I probably had about 6 or 7 meetings over the course of about 8 or 9 months. They were not just the outlandish, myth-believing, just say anything I want to say because I'm angry and I want, my pound of flesh. What I found is that the people that actually would come to that meeting, they might have had some myths, they might have believed some of the dishonest things about the church, or they might have had their bone to pick with the church, but they, because they came face to face and were willing to, let me know who they were still courteous and cordial and not, angry and unruly. So that was really kind of a neat thing to see. And so eventually, I let that kind of go its way, because I was driving 200-mile round trips, to go sit in a coffee shop for 2 hours with people I didn't know. So, there's got to be a better way to reach people. But So going back to my preparation for that, I had kind of practiced on the people and not been very Christian in the way that, our exchanges went on some occasions. And I was winning, some battles, but not winning the war in those cases. So then I kind of regrouped, approached it from a much more prayerful and spiritual way, and saw a great change in that, but still not a lot of fruit. And then I kind of started reaching out more locally and finding some people that, turned out to be, some neat people to talk with. And I think it had more of an impact because of that. So my walk of faith, again, was, being brought out of that miry bog in my baptism, but then really being brought back out of that miry bog with kind of return to the faith, with my marriage and family, with wanting to hand the true and honest faith down to my children, and by the abundance of materials that we have out there to help us re-educate ourselves about what the Catholic Church teaches. Because so often what we learn in high school and grade school and in our young adult life, we forget it, or it gets distorted over time. And so having those types of resources on Spirit Catholic Radio and the Southern Nebraska Register and Catholic Answers and all the many, many books out there available to us, it's just a great resource. So I was kind of rescued the second time out of that miry bog, as Psalm 40, talked about this morning. So again, it started, then I returned to doing it online, evangelizing and doing apologetics in person. And then I got some opportunities to go out and give some talks and, at some parishes or some events, some pro-life events, some evangelism events. And then I met Wayne and Mary, and we decided that we were going to try street evangelization, which I really enjoyed because it was kind of like the coffee shop, but it was more one-on-one, and people would come to me and come to Wayne and Mary and the other evangelists we had, and it was a really neat way to share the faith with people because they were honestly interested in hearing something about the faith. And so, you might post something on Facebook and irritate somebody or perk somebody's interest, but when you're standing out on the street and you aren't really trying to get their attention, they just kind of know you're there and they're like, hey, I'm going to go up and talk to them. Beautiful things can happen. So the street evangelization was another way of kind of living your faith in person that has really produced probably the most fruit of all the stuff I think I've been engaged in over the years, because even just within the last 24 hours, Wayne learned of a conversion story in part because of St. Paul Street evangelization. And so, we have a few of those stories, and it's a neat thing to learn that simply because one of us handed a person a rosary, it changed their life in a way that, they had fallen away from the church, or they weren't even Catholic, and they started, praying the rosary, and it either brought them back to the faith, or they decided, I'm going to join the church. And so I know of 3 solid stories about that happening over the past few years. And so
this person wasn't Catholic, and the rosary wasn't even given to them, it was given to their kid.
Yeah.
Their kid took it,
yeah.
And the family ended up coming into the faith. I mean,
yeah.
they're in the process at North American Martyrs.
Okay. Yeah, so they haven't converted yet.
Yeah, they're at RCIA.
Okay. So there was a college kid that one of us handed a rosary to, and her roommate ended up being a graduate at Pius, and said, well, yeah, I know how to pray the rosary. I can help you learn how to pray that. And then she joined RCIA at UNL. And then a gentleman from Mexico, I was there one morning, and the man was absolutely down and out. And when I came up and started, he was looking at our rosaries, and I said, well, gosh, do you have a rosary? And he said, no. And he had fallen away from the faith and had family troubles, and I didn't know it that day, but it changed his life. And he walked away with a pamphlet in Spanish on the rosary and a rosary, and that was it. And then a year later, he came up to me with a beaming smile on his face, same corner, said, do you remember me? And I said, I do remember you. And he told me the whole story, and that day, everything turned around for him. He returned to the church, started going to confession on a regular basis, and it was just, you can't convey the joy that a situation like that can give you as an evangelist, because it's just, it's an exhilaration you can't describe, but you also can't take credit for it because, the Holy Spirit and stuff, right? So then, after some of the St. Paul Street evangelization, some of the speaking that I was kind of doing around the diocese, I began to write. And so today, probably the most activity I have with regard to evangelization and apologetics is the writing that I do. So I write a regular column for the Southern Nebraska Register. I've written for probably 8 or 9 national publications, from Crisis Magazine to Catholic Answers Magazine. I'm going to have an article coming out here shortly in the New Oxford Review, and several different Catholic websites like Those Catholic Men and The Catholic Gentleman and things like that. So I do a lot of writing, and I've always done a lot of writing, but I never really tried to get anything published. And what I had done is I wrote a couple of things, and I thought, this might be something that would, the Southern Nebraska Register would like. So I sent in a couple of really, really long articles to them, which probably would have filled the whole newspaper, and never heard from them, rightly so, because it was book length, but really good. But so then, I can't remember, it was about 3 years ago, and somebody called me back and said, hey, you sent in an article, proposed article to us a few years ago, and it was on the religious garb law that Nebraska had. And the legislature was looking at potentially repealing that law because there was a nun up in Norfolk that was going to, I think, substitute teach at Norfolk Public Schools. And they said, oh my gosh, we can't have you do it because you wear a habit, and that's against the law. So they ended up not having the nun come in and teach for them. But then that started kind of raising this awareness that, oh my, how could this still be on the books? That's unconstitutional. So the legislature went and changed it. And a lot of the research I had done in writing this article, I think was of interest to some of the people either looking at those laws at that point, or maybe the Register wanted to do an article on it. So then after that, I thought, well, I should send them another article. So I wrote an article on the once saved, always saved fallacy of some walks of the Christian faith, that you can't lose your salvation. So I wrote this, again, a fairly long article, which was much longer than the things I do now. But I think it was a fairly well-written article, because they said, we're going to publish this. And I think it was 2 full pages in the Register. And then since then, I've heard a number of priests are using it in their RCIA and things like that, because it really, I kind of walked through, kind of the way I explain why once saved, always saved is not really a Christian teaching, and it's because of these scripture verses and those other things. So then after that, the Register said, well, would you be interested in writing a column for us, but not such long ones? They limit me to 950 words. And so I've been doing that for about, I think, 3 years now with them. But I really enjoy the writing, and I still write a lot more than I even try to publish, because sometimes I can tell it's not working out. But it helps me think through things. It's kind of a way of praying a little bit as well, furthering my education, understanding of the faith. And then later I might come back and use some of that in a different article, or another idea comes to me and I can bring it back up and alter it and make it something that's of interest to somebody. But that's most of what I do with regard to living my faith now is the writing, and I really enjoy it thoroughly. I've also written like 2 or 3 books which will never get published because they're no good, but it was kind of fun to try and write books too. But so then, and Carmen and I were just kind of talking about this on the way here tonight. She's reading a book by the Popcheks, I think, and it talks about the fact that a person that's active in their faith should always try to engage their whole family in the activity as well, so that dad isn't always gone or mom isn't always gone at the next parish event or the next diocesan event or their next engagement somewhere, leaving the rest of the family back at home. And so we had this conversation a couple years ago, and so I really tried to reorient what I do to kind of stay in around the Hastings area, to kind of staying in the parish, or at least in neighboring parishes and things that the whole family can be involved in. But then I found out the kids really aren't very interested in what I talk about. They hear enough of that at home, I think. So, but no, we've done more of that as well, and so I've cut back a little bit on some of the stuff I do across the state, really, and doing some more stuff closer to home and within the parish itself. And that's been, I think, pretty rewarding because I can still do the writing, but I try to put on events and things like that that really evangelize the people around us. Because what I was doing is I was coming to Lincoln, about once a month, and down in the Haymarket on the corner with St. Paul Street, and we were talking to people from really all over the Midwest, Colorado, Iowa, Scotts Bluff, Omaha, and I'm thinking, this is great, and I think I'm clearly doing God's work here to an extent, but how is this helping St. Cecilia's Parish back in Hastings, or how is this helping my family? One of the questions I oftentimes get from people is, how do I evangelize my brother or sister or adult child that's fallen away from the faith? And what I've always told them is, you probably aren't going to be able to. The thing that you need to do is just live an authentic Catholic life and love them, but you need somebody like me that they run into that maybe will evangelize them, because they aren't really going to listen to you anymore. You've had your crack at them, right? And for some reason that wasn't good enough for them. And so you need to evangelize my family, and I'll evangelize your family. If we get enough people involved in this, all the families are going to be evangelized. Everything's going to be great. But I think there's a lot of sense in saying that the activity that you engage in your faith shouldn't take you far and wide, leaving your family behind you, because that's one of those things that I think a child can grow up if their parent is a very successful or very sought after evangelist, a Scott Hahn type or something like that. That if they weren't really engaged with their family, they're leaving their most important role in life behind them, and their own kids might leave the faith because mom or dad was always gone doing other things and doesn't really care about us. So now I try to do a lot more in the parish and a lot more locally than I had before. I don't do a lot of online evangelism anymore because all my Facebook followers have either disowned me because they're angry at me, or they agree with me. So it's like there's no fun in that. But I still do the writing and the local stuff at the parish a lot more. And then I'm hoping that we'll get back to doing a little bit more St. Paul Street evangelization here soon. Carmen and I are getting ready to move back to Wahoo here next summer, and so it'll be a lot closer to Lincoln, so it wouldn't be as difficult for us to get into Lincoln on a more frequent basis, do a little street evangelization. So in any event, my walk of faith has been one that really follows kind of that Psalm 40. And so as I was sitting in Mass this morning, I thought, well, the other readings are great, but Psalm 40 just really struck me this morning. And I thought, this is kind of a neat way that not only has, inadvertently, or at least I didn't think it was directly my walk of faith over the years, but it would apply to anybody. What Father Morin said this morning is that the first thing about a faith is that you need to wait for God. And that's what Psalm 40 says. Patiently wait for God. Have trust in God, and He will stoop down to you. And my translation is a little different than the translation in the readings this morning, but I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. And, Father Morin did a great job explaining that when we wait for something, our desire for that thing typically increases over time. And he used an analogy of waiting for his dad to get home from work so they could finally eat their evening meal. And as a kid, he was getting hungrier and hungrier. And he also wanted to see his dad, but that desire to get to that next thing was increased as he waited, and if he waited patiently, it ended well. So with our relationship with the Lord, we do need to wait. We need to put ourselves in a position that that He is going to come to us. And it's not so much about us. It's not anything about our will. It is totally about God's will. And so if we wait patiently for the Lord, He comes to us. He writes His will on our heart and puts His message on our tongue. And as Christians, we have an obligation to then turn around and share that with other people. And that's kind of what the rest of Psalm 40 is talking about. I've not hidden your saving help within my heart. I have spoken of your faithfulness and your salvation. So that's really the role of anybody that's Catholic, is that, you know, we can't be hiding our faith within ourselves and make it this, you know, it's a personal faith, but it's not a private faith, and there's a difference between the two. So we need to share that faith with others. And my way of sharing the faith has been, you know, on the street corner, in the coffee shop, on social media, you know, in publishing, you know, articles. But everybody's got a different charism. So, you know, your way of sharing the faith might be, you know, really thoroughly educating your children and being a great example to your children, even more than that, so that they know how to live the faith and they can trust the faith. And to never be the wedge between their faith and God. So you don't want to be hypocritical. You don't want to make promises you can't fulfill. You don't want to, you know, kind of farm out the explanations of faith to others. You want to be the one that exhibits and demonstrates the faith to your children, because it's your obligation to hand your faith down to your children. So Psalm 40 is just a great way to look at, okay, my life as a Catholic, do I see that anywhere in Psalm 40 in my life? Because I suspect that most Catholics do, and there's places where I've fallen short, still do fall short, and so maybe I pray with Psalm 40 to work on those areas a little bit more, so that I can trust God more, I can look for God's will more and try to do God's will more. I can do a better job of explaining to others how my life was delivered from this desolate pit that we hear about in Psalm 40. So that's kind of a 30,000-foot view of where I've come from and where I'm at today. Now I'm going to tell you where I'm going. No, I have no idea where I'm going, but that's a little bit of the walk of faith that I've had. So it was kind of nice to come here tonight and talk to that with the Catholic Coffee Shop series. So with that, does anybody have any questions, or did I leave anything out?
You left out, you know, going crashing Protestant events.
Oh, that's true. I did. Yeah. So that was one of my guilty pleasures, is that as I learned more and more about the Catholic faith, there was some people kind of out there in the non-Catholic world that their focus really isn't Christ. Their focus is trying to discredit the Catholic Church. And that irritates me. So when I saw those people coming to Nebraska, or when other people learned they were coming to Nebraska, they would contact me, and then I'd go to their event. And I would sit in the back and I'd listen to them, or I'd sit sometimes in the front row and listen to them. And then when it came question time, I had a few good questions for them. So that's been a lot of fun over the years. I've done that 4 or 5 times, and Mary and Wayne went with me. I think that was the first time I did it, was with the Jimmy Swaggart preacher.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a blast. So yeah, I got escorted out of a church in Central City one time at a Mike Gendron event. That was a lot of fun. But yeah, that's been enjoyable, because what I found in dealing with these people, as a matter of fact, about a month after Wayne and Mary and I went to this event that was out actually near Grand Island, this particular preacher is on television, I think every day, on one of the Jimmy Swaggart kind of talk shows. And so about a month after doing this, I think that was my first article too. I think I wrote that article, and Catholic Answers published that article. And so I thought, you know, I'm going to check on, see what this guy's doing, you know, now, and see what he says, because I'd call into that show occasionally. That's another thing I do, is I call TV shows and radio shows that are anti-Catholic and ask the personalities on the show pointed questions too. So I could only get this one on the internet, so I opened up the internet and I looked on there, and the show is just starting. And at the beginning of the show, there's a panel of about 6 people usually on this show, and the head of the show is Jimmy Swaggart's wife, and I think her name is Frances. It's called Frances and Friends is the show's name. So Frances would go around to each of her guests every day, and she would ask them, you know, where have you been? You've been out giving talks or workshops or revivals or whatever. and where are you going? Where are you going to be next? So our people know, where you're going to be. So she gets to Jimmy Nations, who was this particular guy that had been in Grand Island, and she says, now Jimmy, you've been out there recently. You were up there in Nebraska now, weren't you? And he goes, yes, I was. And I've never had anything like that happen before, but after my talk, this gentleman came up with me, and he was a Catholic, and he wanted to dialogue. And I said, I don't want to talk to you, and so I wouldn't talk to the man, but never had anything like that happen before. Then they went to the next guy. I'm like, what are the odds that I would pull him up on this show the very day that she asked him that question? He says that. But then I was kind of like, it never happens. I mean, where are we? I mean, we're the most, we're the largest Christian denomination, if you want to call it that, but there's more Catholics in this country than there are any other individual, Christian denomination. He should be confronted everywhere he goes because his arguments are just, they're childish.
Yeah, but
So-
people would have to sit through like 2 hours of
Yeah.
very bad music.
We
Very, very
we
bad
had no
music.
idea what we were getting into.
Oh, man,
I
the
am telling you
music.
what, it was brutal. We paid dearly for that brief opportunity to try and talk with Jimmy Nations. That was a hilarious night. So, but I've had other great nights with other anti-Catholic evangelists that have been a lot of fun, and so that's another thing that I've done. I've tried to, when they're coming here, I don't seek them out, but on several occasions people have called me and said, hey, by the way, I hear this guy is going to be in town, and I'm like, who? I got to do anything I can to get there because that's fun. So any other observations or questions or anything like that?
I have a
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
So this is a what if,
Yeah.
and this is happening in our family.
Okay.
So we have 6 children, 3 don't practice their faith, the other 3 do. But
Yep.
one of our sons, who has a great heart, his wife has recently become a pastor.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, oh gosh, now what do I do?
Yeah, that raises the bar quite a
Yeah.
bit, doesn't it?
And occasionally, just very occasionally, because they don't live here,
Mhm.
and she's like, I haven't found anything that I disagree with Catholic Church on yet. And I'm like, oh, then why didn't you just come this way?
Yeah.
But I have to bite my tongue. Got any
Yeah.
suggestions
Well,
or thoughts?
As a lawyer, I was trained with the Socratic method. And so one of the things I've done over the years is people don't really want to hear so much of what I say. I can come to a talk like this, but it's just not that interesting to a lot of people. So what really gets people going typically is to ask them questions about themselves. So I did another article, probably one of my more well-read articles. It was for Crisis Magazine. And what I'd learned in St. Paul Street evangelization is I would ask people why they weren't Catholic, and they would give me a lot of reasons, And whether they were true or not, they were their reasons. You can't change what they believe to some extent. So what I started doing is I would say, well, what are you? And they would say, what's your daughter-in-law? What faith?
Non-denominational.
Okay, so the question is, why are you non-denominational?
Yeah.
And what I found in St. Paul Street and in other settings when I've done that is, it's because my spouse was, and so I joined their faith, or my parents were, and so that's what I am. And to be honest with you, that's the same thing with Catholics. I mean, we're Catholic mostly by circumstance. We were raised in a Catholic home, and we married a Catholic. Very few of us came to the Catholic faith for an intellectual conversion. I know some that have, and I'm just extremely impressed with them because that is the exception to the rule. So with any other faith, it's the same thing. Very rarely did I have anybody, hundreds of times I asked this on the street, very rarely did anybody say, well, it's because I looked into it and I disagree with that, or I agree with that, or I found I was really attracted to this. Very rarely did that happen. So with your daughter-in-law, for her to say, I really haven't found anything I disagree with the Catholic Church about, maybe to ask her questions like, well, why are you what you are?
True.
And maybe she was raised non-denominational.
No.
Okay, so, but there's something
Yeah.
that drew her to that, and you might be
Yeah.
able to say, well, gosh,
And
there-
we've had some conversations,
Yeah.
so I kind of know She doesn't
Yeah.
like all the rules, whatever, a lot of people.
Yeah, that's,
There's way too many rules in the Catholic Church.
yeah. I know, Jesus didn't have any rules, did he?
Oh.
So, I don't know why we have all the rules, right? No, that's a tough one to get around, because that's an Americanism issue. You know, we're a land of freedom, and freedom is to do what you want, not, what you should. But actually, freedom is to do what you should, right? The right to do what God wants you to do. And so it's a distortion of our concept of what freedom is. And if I can be independent, if I can do my own thing, if I don't have to follow somebody else's rules, I'm an American, and especially in this day and age. So that's a difficult thing that, again, through prayer, your own good example, your own love of her, maybe somebody will come along and help her see, that the Catholic Church isn't about rules, it is about
Yeah.
true freedom. But it takes a long time for some people to get
I
there,
see that.
so that's difficult.
Kind of on the same subject.
Yeah.
It really struck me, and I'd never really thought about this before, but your comment about, what was it? God will come to you.
Yeah,
I'm a convert, and it's always surprised me. In the beginning, I said, okay, God, you show me the way.
Mm.
And it took quite a few years, but it did come.
Mhm.
And it seemed like the more I tried to push it, the further away I got.
yeah,
But what I'm getting at, I feel like with our kids, and it hurts me that they haven't followed our example.
Yeah.
I feel like a total failure.
yeah,
But I also feel that because God has been so patient with me, I owe it to them it's out of my hands. All I can do is be there for them and love them, but
yeah.
it's up to God. I don't know if that's right or wrong, or
I think that's right. I think that, there's so many distractions in the world today. And so this Psalm 40 is kind of neat for the way that it says, wait patiently. And waiting patiently isn't being on your smartphone and being distracted and looking for the next shiny object. Being patient, waiting for God is quieting down, settling down, avoiding those distractions so you can hear God's voice. And that's what the Catholic prayer life is all about. But your children are probably dealing with a lot of distractions in their lives and a lot of other things pulling at them, and maybe some deep-seated questions in their hearts that they have to resolve. And so the role of the parent is, you've done all you can do, and for some reason it didn't stick with them yet, but it doesn't mean it won't come back to them, down the road. They might be drawn out of that miry pit one more time, and it might be the time that sticks. So, people criticize the Catholic Church as being, works-based faith, that, it's up to us to be, to earn our salvation through the good things that we do. And, our faith doesn't teach that. But I think that you evidencing that to them is an extremely important aspect, especially with, maybe a kid that, is distracted, and say, gosh, I'm just living a quiet prayer life, and things are very simple, when you come back for the holidays or whatever, because we aren't out there trying to earn our own salvation and do the things we do. We're patiently waiting for God's voice over and over again. I don't know. Difficult. The family situations are the toughest. It's easy to run into a non-Catholic or an atheist or an Eastern mystic on the street and have a conversation with them because they're gone and you'd never really think about it too much again. But with your own adult child or your sibling or your cousin, it's something that really sticks with you, and it's a difficult situation. It's the most common question I think that I get whenever I'm out doing a talk on evangelization. And there's no one right answer other than to be faithful and prayerful yourself, and then to hope that God puts them in that place where they do start to yearn for God, or that they can quiet down and actually hear God's voice for them, maybe the first time in a long time. It's tough. Yeah.
Particular things recite sometimes with these children. Do you have suggestions along those lines? And I think, as we were talking here, when you have married adult children,
Yeah,
what's the influence of the spouse?
yep,
And you could be all the way from one son who you wonder if he's just going along
yeah,
to keep that family and
Yeah.
that together. And then you have one that's gone along the agnostic route, is about what I would call it.
yep.
But is there anything that you've,
Well, one thing you should know, and you probably do know this, is that you are always being watched by them. So they're always looking for that opportunity to say, that's hypocritical, or this is why I didn't believe in what you were telling me. You aren't living up to your faith. You aren't being a very good Christian. So to minimize the opportunities for them to do that is very important. So, and you're not only doing that maybe for your own child, but for their spouse and for their children. Because on some occasions, I've had relatives come up to me and say, you know, I want you to, I can't remember what Troy said that one time. He goes, I want you to, I don't know, give my eulogy at my funeral or something, because you're the only Christian I really know. And so it's like, so how do you know that? Because, I mean, we don't talk about faith either, but they see admirable traits sometimes, and they're drawn toward that. And it might only come out on very brief and very rare occasions, but you are being watched. And if you can provide them with good things, with positive things, so that they're intrigued, that they're drawn toward it, even if today they're resistant to it, in a time of trouble, there's probably going to be that opportunity for them to turn to that instead of something in the world. And you're the light in the darkness to them at that point. No matter how, long, they are in the tooth, or you are in the tooth, or how long they've been away from the church. I've seen it happen in my own family, that people that have been away from the church are drawn back to the faith through, somebody's death in the family or some other tragedy. And, what you're doing a lot of times is you're putting yourself in that position to be that person that they feel comfortable in confiding with, because you haven't been aggressive toward them, you haven't been condemning toward them, you have lived in a way that's consistent with what you talk, you walk the walk. And so in that time of trouble, they'll be like, I can trust Dad, or I can trust Grandpa, or I can trust my uncle or my brother or my sister, because I don't think they're going to mislead me. I'm gonna go to them and honestly ask them these questions. And so if you can just always try to put yourself in that position, then I think you're doing God's will, and patiently waiting not only for God but for that opportunity. I don't know, it's not easy. Any other questions or thoughts?
Have you had a chance to look at, just recently I've noticed Catholic Answers is putting out a course on apologetics.
Yeah.
And we have, our last child is 18 and very into his faith and
Mhm.
theology, and he talks to everybody. But I don't know if this would be a good thing for us to do together with him, to give him a better method.
Yeah. I really,
Because he really
Yeah.
is good with it.
yeah, I think Catholic Answers is just
Here,
such a valuable resource. As a matter of fact, one of the first things I did probably when I stopped, just doing the online back and forth with people, is I bought, it was either a DVD or a CD, and it was either Patrick Madrid or Patrick Coffin, but I think it was put up by Catholic Answers, and it talked a lot about, how to win the battle and not lose the war, I think is what it was called.
Oh.
And it really was an eye-opener, and it helped me realize that my approach was not attractive, and it was not fulfilling in the least to me either. So those types of resources are great, and I don't think Catholic Answers is going to steer anybody wrong, especially with apologetics, because
Okay.
there's really no organization out there that is better at apologetics than Catholic Answers, because that is truly their focus. So you'll get apologetics from Scott Hahn's website, and Steve Ray, and David Anders, and all these others, but there's a lot of other stuff there as well, whereas, you know, Catholic Answers is really laser trained on the apologetics aspect and does
Good point.
such an amazing job. You know, one thing that I'm always surprised by when I'm dealing with the anti-Catholic radio personalities or TV personalities, you know, they are so aggressive and so negative toward the Catholic faith that you cannot, as a Catholic, call them and speak to them and have an intellectual conversation. They won't receive it. But you can have the most vitriolic anti-Catholic call into Catholic Answers, and they're just received with, you know,
I guess.
calm courtesy, and you know, they might have to mute them if they won't shut up, but you know, for the most part, they don't mute them, whereas people get muted all the time with these other anti-Catholic, you know, personalities, and it's just incredibly unfair. So, yeah, I think Catholic Answers is a great resource. Yeah.
Bob, I follow you as Southern Nebraska Register all the time.
Oh.
I think I've got all your articles. In fact, I've cut out a good number of them. And I appreciate Don't Quit Writing.
It's so much fun. Yeah,
You
thank you.
touched on some good things. You took the series on the education.
Yeah.
That was really good.
Yeah.
You know, where the Catholic we are is
Yeah.
educating the kids.
That's one that's really on my heart. I was elected to the public school board out in Hastings. So I'm just about done with my term. I'm going to have to resign right before it ends, but because we'll be moving. But you know, one of the things that living your faith has to be done in the public sphere. You can't just live your faith in your parish, in your home, because my kids now see me engaging with the public school system and people across the community, and they know that I go to these meetings, and you know, I don't send my kids to the public school. They all go to the Catholic schools. And so it was a huge eye-opener for a lot of people across Hastings, because they're like, how can you be on the school board if you don't send your kids to the public school? It's like, well, that's not one of the criteria. And so living your faith is very important to do in that public sphere. The reason I did that is because I was always telling guys in Hastings, you know, we got to get out there. We got to live our faith in a way that, you know, transforms the culture around us. And in a town of 25,000 people, a parish of, you know, probably 800 men, you know, within our families, we could have a huge impact if we all just did a little bit publicly along those lines. Well, at the time I was a city attorney in Hastings, so I was out in the public anyway being the city attorney, and then they decided they're going to hire a full-time city attorney, and I didn't want to be the full-time city attorney, so all of a sudden I was no longer active in the public sphere professionally, and I thought, I better do something. So I thought, well, they're never going to elect me to the public school board, so I ran, and then they elected me. So, but yeah, so living your life in the public sphere, I don't have that on my little list here, but that's probably one of the most important things I think I've done over the years, is to witness my faith that way.
Branching a bit into that, wife and I are kind of political, mainly myself. I think I get myself in trouble on the politics end. But it comes to a question that if anything is more frustrating to me is the status the Catholic Church has today in the public sphere.
Yeah.
An article in the paper just here a week or two ago was a definitive decision on abortion by the evangelical community. I wait and hunger for when we've got 70-some million people that are Catholics, in name at least, in the United States. We don't seem to speak with one voice.
That's
when
right.
it comes to the swinging politics
Yeah.
in this country.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to go there or not.
Well,
That's a whole
there's
other discussion.
in trying to evangelize one of my companions there in Hastings, I was offered to read a couple of books written by atheists, one of which is written by Jonathan Haidt. His last name is spelled H-A-I-D-T, and that book is called, I can't remember the name of the book now, but even though this guy is an atheist, and I totally disagree with his approach to many things, he is very knowledgeable with the political world and the way that people's brains work, especially as political animals. And the reason that we have maybe 20% of our Catholic population in the United States that actually practices the faith on a fairly consistent basis, and about 80% don't, is because a lot of people are attracted to the Catholic faith because of its, you know, the way that it teaches love and their distortion of what authentic love truly is. And so I'm gonna feed the poor. And that's really 99% of what I do as a Catholic, because we have a soup kitchen in our parish, and that's what I do. And I actually don't go to Mass very often, but I go to that soup kitchen once a week for sure. And they can call themselves Catholic because of that. The other reason, and I just kind of came to this myself, is that a lot of people, you know, were raised Catholic, might have been loyal Catholic, but had that wedge driven and have fallen away over time, but they still identify as Catholic because they've still never found anything else out there that's nearly as attractive as Catholic faith, at least what they think the Catholic faith is. And so they don't become another religion, or they don't become an agnostic or an atheist, and when the census comes out, they still check the Catholic box because they just aren't anything else. And so when we hear about the fact that the Catholic Church doesn't speak with one voice in the U.S., to an extent that's true, but also if you look at it from a different perspective is, you know, really the core of the Catholic Church is, you know, anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20% of the people that check the box on the census as Catholic. And we do speak in one voice. And if we did that more efficiently and more thoroughly and with more organization, we would have a much better, you know, I think, effect on the country than we do. We're still very disorganized, and I think some people feel a little bit discouraged the fact that, okay, we've got 75 million Catholics in the U.S., the Catholic vote should determine every single election that happens, right? Well, some people are like, well, it's not, and so why vote? And they might be the faithful Catholics, whereas the ones that are, you know, more lackadaisical, lukewarm, are the ones that are actually still going out and voting and skewing these election results significantly. But what I always like to point out is, though, don't put your faith in princes. And you know, politics is all fine and good, but what we have to do is live our faith to the fullest and make sure that even if we get discouraged by the fact that we got so many people that identify as Catholic that don't know what the Catholic Church actually teaches, that we do, and so we need to live a life that helps them understand that over time.
I think one of your articles addressed the Eucharist, and
Yeah.
I think you would be saying that who's sitting in church, even, who comes through the doors, do we really believe in,
Yeah.
which is fundamentally, why would you be there? I think your article said something like, what the hell, or something, you know, what is it?
Oh, if it's just a symbol, you
just
can go to hell.
a symbol, to hell with it,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
and
Flannery O'Connor. That's true, and it's sad that, you know, probably even in the Lincoln Diocese, which is probably one of the better catechized groups of Catholics in the country, you know, 100% of the people at Mass on Sunday is not the number that believes in the actual Catholic teaching on the Eucharist. So it's something less than 100%, and until it reaches 100%, we've got some work to do. So, yeah. One of my questions to the gentleman that gave me the books by the atheists are, you know, I said, well, what, you know, are you a Christian? And he said, well, yeah, I am. I said, do you believe in heaven or hell? No, I don't. So then we talked about other things. So I thought I gotta ask him what he thinks about Jesus next time. So next time we got together, I said, who is Jesus to you? And he said, historical figure. But he still identifies as a Christian. And people just have so many different thoughts and beliefs. I was able to actually ask him questions that made him really think hard about some of those things, I think. And that's where I think asking questions is the best way, because it forces them to come up with the answers. And if they aren't happy with the answer they came up with, they might do the research that helps them come up with the right answer, or at least a better answer than they currently have. So, any other questions that anybody has?
So what are you planning to do when you come back to Wahoo?
Same stuff.
Are we gonna know about it?
Well, I'll still
How are
write
we
my
gonna know
articles.
about it, is what
Yeah.
I wanna know.
Well, it's going to be this summer, and so I'll just continue to practice law and write for the Register and for other places, and hopefully do a little more street evangelization if I can talk Wayne and Marion to helping me. And others.
We need help.
I
If we're
think,
gonna do
I
it,
think we, yeah,
we do need help, cause it was a lot
and I
for
definitely think
a
our,
few people.
he'll be
and it's just-
19
it was
then,
a
Yeah.
he'll
lot.
be, I think he would
might
definitely
get
be
a
on
kick
it.
out of it.
No, I know he would. You might get a kick out of him.
It's easy to do, I mean, testify to that,
Yeah.
and it's,
Piece of cake.
if you can talk to someone, then you're qualified.
Well,
I mean, if you're,
talk to
if you,
everybody, yeah.
it's not, if you don't know the answer, say I don't know the answer.
Oh yeah, that's all right.
I
I'm
can
like, I'll
find
go
it.
find the answer
I
if
can
you want me
find
to.
it,
Yeah,
you
that's
know.
what I always say.
Yep. Yep.
Probably Googled it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Google it, it's true.
What brings you to Wahoo now?
I grew up in Wahoo, so I graduated from Newman back in 1986, and then went on to college and law school. And my oldest brother's been practicing law out in Hastings since 1974, I think. So I went in with him. But Carmen and I have always talked about moving back toward Wahoo. She's from Dorchester, and most of her family's back in this part of the state. And so when my parents passed away, we bought their house and have been going back there, occasionally over the years. And so the time was just right. We always left it up. We have 5 daughters. We're the parents of 5 daughters, and we talked about this several years ago. And the oldest 2 said, "Absolutely not. I am not moving out of Hastings." So the second oldest graduates from high school this May, and so she lost her vote. So the younger 3 are like, "I don't care. I'm ready to go if you want to." So they're like, "All right, it's unanimous. We're going." So. So I'll be able to practice law back in Wahoo, and my practice is pretty much statewide anyway, so I don't have to be in any one specific location. So I'm gonna do that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah.
That'll be fun.
All right, well, thank you. Should we end in a prayer too?
Yes.
Please.
All right. Brett, would you like to lead us in a prayer?
Sure.
All right.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Let us pray as our Lord taught us. Our Father,
Who art in heaven,
Hallowed be thy name.
thy kingdom come,
Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for coming, guys.